I pulled my coat tighter as the cold Los Angeles rain came down in sheets. It had been one of those long nights, the kind where the past catches up with you in silence. I had just finished dinner at a quiet diner, one of those old-school places where the waitresses still called you Han, and the coffee was stronger than the attitude. The neon sign buzzed above me as I stepped outside, the streets slick and shining under the dim streetlights. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the curb, barely more than a shadow, a kid no older than 10. His hoodie was too thin for a night like this, the sleeves torn at the edges, his jeans soaked through. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, like he was trying to keep himself from shaking. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Big, dark, wide with something that wasn't just hunger or cold. Something deeper. He stepped forward, hesitating like he wasn't sure if he should be doing this. His voice came out small, almost swallowed by the rain. "Mr. Eastwood, please. I need help." The way he said it made something in my gut twist. I'd been stopped by fans before, adults, teenagers, even kids, but this wasn't that. This wasn't someone looking for a picture or an autograph. This was different. I studied him. "What's your name, kid?" He hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. For a second, I thought he might bolt. "Tommy." The name barely left his lips, like he wasn't sure he should be telling me. I nodded, glancing around. No one else was watching. The city moved on without him, without either of us. "You alone out here?" I asked. His gaze dropped to ground. He nodded. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my chest. This wasn't just some kid lost for a few hours. This was something else. The rain picked up, heavier now, cold drops sliding down the back of my neck. I could have walked away. I should have, but I didn't. "Come on," I said, jerking my head toward the diner behind me. "Let's get you something warm to eat." For a second, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he followed. The bell above the door jingled as we stepped inside. Warm air hit us, thick with the smell of coffee and grilled burgers. The place was nearly empty. Just a trucker in the corner nursing a cup of black coffee, and an old man reading a newspaper at the counter. The waitress behind the register barely looked up, just waved a tired hand. I led the kid to a booth by the window. He hesitated before sliding into the seat across from me, his eyes darting around like he wasn't used to sitting somewhere warm. "You ever been here before?" I asked, picking up the sticky menu. He shook his head, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. I signaled the waitress, a woman named Nancy I'd known for years. She shuffled over, pen ready. "What can I get you, Han?" I glanced at the kid. "Burger?" He nodded, barely above a whisper. "And a hot chocolate," I added, "extra whipped cream." Nancy gave me a look, but didn't ask questions. "Same for you?" "Just coffee." She scribbled it down and walked off. I watched as Tommy rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. His fingers were red and raw. The skin cracked in places. He was young, too young to be out in weather like this alone. "How long you been on the streets?" I asked. He kept his eyes on the table. "A while." Not much of an answer, but I didn't push. I knew that kind of talk took time. The rain outside at the window, in steady drops. I leaned back, studying him. There was something in his face, something familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The hot chocolate came first. Steam rising from the cup, he wrapped his hands around it, taking a sip so fast he burned his tongue. He didn't care. It was warm. I waited until the burger landed in front of him before asking the question that had been nagging at me since outside. "What's your last name, Tommy?" He swallowed his first bite too fast, then looked up at me. There was something guarded in his eyes, like he was trying to decide whether to tell me or not. Finally, he said it. "Callahan." The name stopped me cold. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. That name wasn't just familiar. It meant something. It carried a weight I hadn't felt in years. I tried to keep my face calm, but inside, my mind was racing. "Callahan," I repeated. He nodded, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. I cleared my throat. "You got family?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." My fingers curled around my coffee cup. I didn't say anything for a long time. Just listened to the rain, to the sound of him chewing, to the hum of the diner around us. Jack Callahan. I hadn't heard that name in years, but I knew it well, too well, and if this kid was telling the truth, that meant one thing. I wasn't just looking at some lost boy. I was looking at the son of a man I once called my friend. The kid kept eating like he hadn't had a real meal in days, maybe longer. I didn't say anything for a while, just let him finish. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. The name Callahan wasn't one I could just ignore. It wasn't just some stranger's name. It belonged to someone I used to know, someone I hadn't thought about in a long time. Jack Callahan. We had served together a lifetime ago, back when we were young and thought we were invincible. He was one of the good ones, loyal, tough, always looking out for the guys around him. But life after war wasn't always kind. Some made it out, some didn't. And Jack had vanished. One day, he was just gone. I had tried looking for him once, years ago. A few old contacts, a couple of dead ends, then nothing. I figured maybe you wanted it that way. Some guys do. Some ghosts don't want to be found. But now, sitting across from this kid with the same last name, I felt something I hadn't in years. A pull, a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. I finally spoke. Your dad's name wasn't Jack, was it? Tommy's chewing slowed. His eyes flicked up at me, cautious. He swallowed hard, like the words were stuck in his throat. You knew my dad? I set my coffee down. A long time ago. He stared at me, like he was trying to decide if he could trust me. Then his shoulders dropped a little. He left, Tommy mumbled. Never came back. I leaned back, the weight in my chest growing heavier. Jack Callahan wasn't the type of man to just walk away from his kid. Something wasn't right. Your mom, I asked carefully, where is she? He dropped his gaze. She died a while back. I let that sink in. No mom, no dad, just a kid alone in the world. I exhaled slowly, watching the way his fingers tightened around his cup, like he was bracing himself for more questions he didn't want to answer. What happened to your dad? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, I don't know. His voice was barely there, just a breath of sound. But in that moment, I knew he wasn't lying. He really didn't know. And that meant one thing. Jack Callahan hadn't just left. Something had happened to him. Something this kid had been running from ever since. The rain had slowed by the time we stepped outside, but the air was still thick with the smell of wet pavement. Tommy pulled his hood up like he was trying to disappear into it. I kept my hand in my pockets, watching the cars pass, my mind stuck somewhere between the past and the present. I had questions, a lot of them, but I knew better than to push too hard. Kids like Tommy, kids who had spent too much time surviving, weren't quick to trust. We walked for a while without talking. The city was still awake, neon signs flickering, the hum of traffic filling the empty spaces between us. He kept glancing around, checking behind him, like he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. I finally broke the silence. Where are you staying? He shrugged. Wherever. That's not much of an answer. It's the only one I got. I stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change. Tommy hesitated, then reached into his pocket. His fingers fumbled with something. Then he pulled out a crumpled photograph. He held it out to me without saying a word. I took it carefully. The edges were worn, the paper soft from being handled too much. The picture was old, probably 10, 15 years at least. In it, a man stood with a little boy on his shoulders. The man was grinning, his arm wrapped around a woman who was laughing at something off camera. My chest tightened. It was Jack. Younger, happier, but still Jack. The same sharp jawline, the same easy grin. And the kid on his shoulders had to be Tommy. I looked up. Your mom gave you this? He nodded. Before she got sick. I studied the photo again, my fingers gripping it a little tighter. The man in this picture wasn't the kind to walk away from his family. I knew that in my gut. Something had happened to him. Something bad. I handed the picture back. You keep this with you? Always. I exhaled slowly. Come on, I said. We're going to find out what really happened. Tommy didn't say anything. He just nodded, slipping the photo back into his pocket, like it was the only thing in the world keeping him from falling apart. I made some calls. Old contacts. People who used to know things before they happened. Most were either out of the game or on the ground, but a few still picked up when they saw my name. It took an hour before I got a lead. A trailer park on the outskirts of town. Jack Callahan's last known address. Tommy hadn't asked questions when I told him we were going for a drive. He just climbed into the truck, hugging his arms to his chest, the same way he had back in the diner. I could tell he was nervous, but he didn't say a word. The city lights faded behind us, replaced by dark roads lined with tired-looking houses. The rain had stopped completely now, but the clouds still hung low, making everything feel heavier. I kept my eyes on the road, but every so often I glanced over at Tommy. He was staring out the window, his fingers playing with the edge of his sleeve. "You ever been out this way?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't think so." He didn't think so. That told me everything I needed to know. No one had brought him here. No one had told him about this place. Someone had made sure he never found it. The trailer park wasn't much to look at. Rows of faded white trailers, some with rust creeping up the sides, others with windows covered in old blankets instead of curtains. A few kids were kicking a deflated soccer ball near a chain-link fence, but most people stayed inside, peeking out from behind cracked blinds. I pulled up near the office. Tommy shifted beside me, his knee bouncing. "You ready?" I asked. He nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. The office was nothing more than a shed with flickering light above the door. Inside, a man sat behind a desk, flipping through a dog-eared magazine. He barely looked up when we walked in. "Something I can do for you?" I pulled out my wallet, slid a 20 across the counter, looking for information. Guy named Jack Callahan used to live here. The man's fingers hovered over the bill, eyes flicking up to meet mine. I saw it then, that shift, the hesitation. "Why you looking?" I nodded toward Tommy. "His son." The man looked at Tommy, then back at me. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, then sighed, pushing the 20 back toward me. "Jack's dead." Tommy stiffened beside me. I felt it like a punch to the gut. "How?" I asked, my voice steady. The man leaned back in his chair. "Overdose. 2 years ago. Found him in his trailer. Sad deal." I glanced down at Tommy. His face was blank, too blank, like he had shut everything off. Jack Callahan. Dead. I had come here for answers, but all I'd found was another dead end. Another ghost. But something didn't sit right. Jack had never touched drugs. Not when I knew him. Not ever. So how the hell had he ended up overdosing? Tommy hadn't moved since the words left the man's mouth. Dead. Overdose. 2 years ago. He just stood there, small and still, his face empty like he wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. I knew that look. I'd seen it in soldiers when they got bad news. When something they'd been holding on to, hoping for, got ripped away. The man behind the desk didn't seem to notice. He just grabbed his magazine again, like he had already forgotten we were there. I leaned in, lowering my voice. Jack wasn't the type to use. The guy snorted. That's what they all say. I kept my expression even. "You find him yourself?" "Nah. Neighbor did. Trailer door was open. Cop said it was clear. Needle the whole thing. The whole thing. That was the part that didn't sit right. Jack and I had been through hell together. I'd seen him broken, seen him beaten down, but I'd never seen him quit. And this felt like quitting. I turned to Tommy. He was staring at the counter, fists clenched at his sides. I put a hand on his shoulder. "You good?" He nodded, but I didn't buy it. I turned back to the guy. Who was his neighbor? The man hesitated, scratching at his neck. Trailer 14. Old guy, name's Bert. I gave him a nod, then walked out, Tommy right beside me. The air felt heavier now, like the world had shifted just a little. The trailer park was quieter than before, like even the wind had decided to hold its breath. Trailer 14 was near the back. tucked behind an old chain-link fence half covered in vines. The porch sagged under its own weight, and a rusted truck sat out front, the tires sunk deep in the mud. I knocked. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, the door creaked open. Bert was wiry, with skin like old leather and eyes that had seen too much. He peered at me, then at Tommy, then back to me. "You the one to skib out, Jack?" I nodded. "Just want to know what happened." Bert's eyes flickered at Tommy again. Then he pushed the door open wider. "Come in." Inside, the place smelled like tobacco and old wood. Bert lowered himself into a chair, motioning for us to sit. "People round here don't like talking about Jack," he said, "like they're scared of something." "Scared of what?" Bert took a slow breath. "Jack was looking for somebody before he died. Said someone took his boy." My stomach dropped. Tommy shifted beside me, his breath hitching. Bert nodded, like he had expected that reaction. Kept saying he had to find him, that he was close. Then one day he just stopped. Next thing I hear, he's dead in his trailer. Silence stretched between us. I looked down at Tommy. His hands were gripping his knees, so hard his knuckles had gone white. I leaned in, my voice calm but firm. Who was he looking for? Bert's jaw tightened. Then finally he said it. His wife's brother, a guy named Eddie. Tommy's breath came out sharp. His body went rigid. I turned to him. "You know him?" Tommy's head moved, just barely. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he said, "He used to hurt my mom. Then me." A cold anger settled in my chest. Jack Callahan hadn't overdosed. He had been silenced. Tommy wouldn't look at me, wouldn't look at Bert, just stared at the floor, his hands balled into fists, so tight his nails had to be digging into his palms. I could hear his breathing, shaky and uneven, like he was trying to hold something in, but didn't know how much longer he could. Eddie. I'd never heard the name before, but I knew exactly who he was. The kind of man who thought fear made him strong, who thought pain was something he had the right to hand out. And from the way Tommy had stiffened when he said his name, I knew the scars Eddie left weren't just the kind you could see. Bert ran a hand over his face. Jack wasn't the same after his wife died. But when he found out Eddie had his kid, it was like something snapped. He went looking, asking questions, pushing into places people don't come back from. I clenched my jaw. And then he overdosed. Bert's mouth tightened, but he didn't correct me, because we both knew the truth now. Jack didn't overdose. Jack got too close. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. I remember him. I turned to him, keeping my voice steady. "Eddie." Tommy nodded, his body too still. "He came after my mom died. Said he was family. Said he'd take care of me." His fingers curled against his knees. But he didn't. I didn't need details. I could hear everything in his voice. The weight of it. The way he'd been carrying it for too long. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "Where is he now?" Tommy swallowed hard. "Last time I saw him, he was in the city." He hesitated, then, almost like he hated himself for saying it, "He finds me sometimes." The world around me slowed. "He finds you." Tommy nodded, barely there. "When he needs money." I felt something cold settle inside me. "You ever tell anyone?" Tommy laughed, but it wasn't real. Just a breath of something broken. "Who?" "Nobody." That was his answer. There was nobody. I pushed up from my chair. My hands felt steady, but my blood was running hot. "Give me a name. A place." Bert shifted in his seat. "You sure you want to do this?" I gave him a look. He sighed. "I heard he's been hanging around the old lot-off tent, running things out of garage there." Tommy looked up at me then. Something in his eyes, something unsure. "What are you going to do?" I met his gaze. What should have been done a long time ago. Tommy didn't speak, just nodded. I turned toward the door, my mind already 10 steps ahead, already thinking about what came next. Because Eddie Callahan had taken too much from too many people. And tonight, that was going to end. The sun had barely set by the time we pulled up to the old lot on 10th. The garage was a shell of what it once was. Its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti, the kind that made everything feel dark and dangerous. But it was the perfect place for someone like Eddie Callahan to hide. Tommy sat quietly beside me, his hands tight in his lap. He hadn't said much since we left Bert's, and I didn't expect him to. The whole weight of everything was too much for a kid his age, and I could see it in the way his eyes kept darting around, like he expected something to jump out of shadows at any moment. But we couldn't turn back now. We were already too deep into this. And Eddie had to pay for what he'd done. Not just to Jack, but to Tommy. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as I parked near the back of the lot. The place was empty, quiet, except for the low hum of a single light above the garage door. I didn't see any movement, but I knew better than to think that meant we were alone. Eddie had been hiding for a long time. He wasn't going to let anyone waltz in without a fight. Stay close, I said to Tommy, my voice low but firm. He nodded, his eyes wide, but he didn't say anything. I could tell he was scared, but there was something else too, something like determination. He was tired of running. He was ready for this to be over. We moved silently through the dark, slipping behind the garage, careful not to make a sound. I checked the windows first. No one inside. Good. But I wasn't taking any chances. I turned to Tommy. You stay back here. Keep quiet. If something happens, you get in the truck and you drive. Got it? Tommy nodded, though he looked like he wanted to argue. But he didn't. He knew I wasn't going to ask again. I moved around to the front, my hand resting on the grip of the gun under my jacket. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I wasn't going in unprepared either. The door to the garage was locked, but I had a trick for that. A quick snap of the lock, and it creaked open. The inside was just as I expected. The faint smell of gasoline and grease mixed with a sour stench of something else. Something I couldn't place, but it didn't matter. There were tools scattered across a workbench. Stacks of crates piled in the corner, but no sign of Eddie. Yet, I moved deeper into the garage, my eyes scanning the shadows. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound, followed by a low laugh. Didn't think you'd come, a voice called from the back. I froze. Thought you'd be too scared, Eddie continued, his voice laced with that sick kind of confidence that only people who hide behind fear can have. I stepped forward, my pulse quickening. I'm not here to talk, Eddie. There was a pause. I think you are. Then, just like that, he appeared. Eddie was older than I remembered, his face more weathered, his eyes crazed like a man who had lived too long in the dark. He had a bottle in his hand, and his smile was all teeth. You should have stayed out of this, old man, Eddie sneered. You've already lost. I didn't flinch. Not yet. Eddie tossed the bottle aside and reached for something in his jacket. A gun. I saw the glint of metal, and everything slowed for a second. But I was faster. I moved before he could pull it, disarming him with a quick motion, my hand on his wrist before he knew what hit him. The gun hit the floor with a sharp clatter, and I grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. Enough! I growled, my face inches from his. This ends tonight. Eddie's grin never faltered. You think I'm scared of you? No, I said, my voice cold. But I think you should be scared of him. Tommy stepped into the doorway, his eyes locked on Eddie with a look I hadn't seen before, a look of someone who had finally found the strength to stand up. Eddie's face twisted, and I saw the moment when he realized who Tommy was. His eyes narrowed. You've been following me, haven't you? Tommy didn't answer. He just stood there silent, but his eyes never left Eddie's. Eddie looked at me, then back at Tommy. A twisted smile crept across his face. You think this is over? Huh? You think you've won. I pulled Eddie back from the wall, twisting his arm behind his back. It's over, Eddie. It's over for good. You can't stop what's coming, Eddie spat. I already have, I said. Then, without another word, I pushed him toward the truck. Tommy didn't move. Get in the truck, Tommy, I said, my voice steady. Tommy hesitated, just for a moment, before walking over to the truck. He didn't look back, but I could see the weight lifting from his shoulders. I turned to Eddie, who was struggling against me, but it was no use. His strength was fading. I want you to remember something, I said, looking him in the eye. You don't get to hurt anyone else. Not anymore. And with that, I shoved him into the backseat of the truck, slammed the door shut, and climbed into the driver's seat. The night was still heavy, but as we drove away from that old lot, I could feel something shift. It was like the first real breath either of us had taken in years. Tommy didn't say anything as we drove, and I didn't push him to. He didn't need to talk. Not yet, but I knew he'd speak when he was ready. When the weight of the past was behind him, he'd find his voice again. And when he did, he'd be stronger than any of us ever thought possible. And for the first time, I saw it. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone who had found his strength. We were driving toward a new beginning, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one.